now at starting time. Let me formally welcome you all to this first meeting of 2025, and to welcome back Eli Friedwald as a speaker. Those who were privileged to hear his previous presentation to us on what was in the Rabbi's suitcase. I see that he's brought some books with him. It was really a very masterful presentation, and when he told me that he was in professional life an actuary, it was really quite clear from the clear way that he was able to present all the material, and it was really quite a magical evening. So we're very glad to have you back, Eli. And we're in an area where there are a number of streets that are named after Zionist leaders, Christian Zionists. So very appropriate that this meeting, which includes the story of Oliphant, is probably only a few hundred meters from the street that's named after him. So Eli, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's also appropriate that Lawrence Oliphant was a Scotsman, and I believe that you're a Scotsman, Kenneth, which is what makes you so enthusiastic to listen to this particular schmooze. I've called my lecture Two Lovers of Zion. Obviously, Chovevei Zion is the Hebrew term that comes to mind. And I have two characters over here. One of them is much more famous than the other. Well, there may be some Jews that's not so obvious, but Lawrence Oliphant was a much bigger personality than Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz. And I will explain why I've selected Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz to represent the Chovevei Zion movement, the frum Jewish aspects of Lovers of Zion. And it's obvious why I've chosen Lawrence Oliphant as we go through. We see that he's a primary character in the work of Christian Zionists, who were very, very important in actually setting up a financial framework and a political framework for the establishment of the State of Israel. They were very, very much earlier on in history, but yet their work was really very important and very fundamental. I'm allowed to instruct you to press for next. I don't like giving instructions, but I have to do so.
I'd like you to say please after every instruction. It will be fine.
Thank you. I'll only say next please once. It will just be next. Okay, so we have a Jewish lover of Zion and we have a Christian lover of Zion. It's obvious which one is the Christian, one is the one with the bigger beard. So we have over here Elber Hirschowitz, Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz, and we have over there Lawrence Oliphant. And just a little bit of a background to them before we start drilling down in detail. Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz appears in the letters of the Reinowitz collection, which were the topic for the book. Over here, the Rabbi's suitcase. He saw himself as being a student, a Talmud Rabbi Yaakov Reinowitz himself, who was then a dyer in the London based in, a great-great-grandfather of my wife Adele, during the 1880s. And when Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz came to London, he had a particular mission and gradually became more and more attached to Rabbi Yaakov Reinowitz. And even though he traveled the world subsequently, Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz, he continued to be in close correspondence on all halachic matters with Dayan Reinowitz, who represented, if you like, the London Beis Din and the halachic authority. Essentially, my talk suggests that there are two channels of Chovevei Zion. There's the Chovevei Zion that we know, like Rachov Chovevei Zion around here, which represents the Jewish brand of those lovers of Zion. Networks, groups that were mainly based in Eastern Europe. Many towns had their own Chovevei Zion movement, and they raised funds, and they encouraged Aliyah. They wanted to buy land in Israel on a small scale. They were all very modest, but they created a movement which gradually gained momentum as the conditions in the Pale of Settlement and in Russia worsened after the pogroms. Then they really gained some further momentum. So Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz will represent that stream. And then there was the Christian stream. And just to talk a little bit about the generality of the Christian stream, what do we mean by Christian Zionists? Well, some people think they are referring here to missionaries, and obviously missionaries are one variant of Christian Zionists. But historically, the interest in Christian Zionism started probably after the Reformation in England, after Henry VIII. He changed the whole religious structure in England. What he did was to bring in a much more of a democratic approach. The people should be able to read the Bibles for themselves and not have it lectured to them by someone who understood it only in its Latin form. And he instigated that Bibles should be brought into every church. They should be in English translation, and every Englishman has the right to read the Bible for himself. Now that was actually very, very important, because almost for the first time, ordinary Englishman, and particularly the intelligent Englishman, was able to read the Hebrew prophets for himself for the first time. He wasn't really familiar before that with Yeshayahu and Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu, Isaiah, Amos, etc. They weren't really known, and because they weren't known, there wasn't the level of attachment that Christians had to it. Once they started to read the Bible in English, large numbers of Christians almost decided that the Hebrew prophets were more interesting and more moralizing and spoke to them more than their own Christian texts. And that was a very interesting transition. And it led to them being interested in the content of the Jewish Bible, which means the expulsion from the Holy Land, the destruction of the temple, the promises that the prophets had the Jews would return to the Holy Land in the future. They became much more Jewish-type messianic. They exchanged some of their Christian writings really for the Jewish prophets. And that promoted, if you like, intellectually the idea of Christian Zionism. And over the period up to the 1600s, the 1700s, this threatened from. In the 1800s, a number of very powerful, important, influential figures coincided with really the increase in importance of the British Empire and its reach across the world. And people who were like Lord Shaftesbury, who was a very, very strong Zionist in the early and middle 1800s. Later on, Lord Palmerston, who was the Prime Minister, who is involved in some of the discussions we see later on. A real Zionist. Benjamin Disraeli, who you could see as being both Jewish and Christian at the same time, he was a Meshumad, a strong Zionist. And ultimately Lord Balfour and Balfour Declaration in 1917. So you see a picture beginning to develop, a very strong stream of Christian Zionists. Next, Rabbi Hirschowitz, who was born in 1838, if you can move on to the next slide. You're falling asleep, Kenneth. I'm already boring you. Anyway, he was born in Russia, received smicha from the Gedolim in Russia, and in 1884 he first appears on the scene. He appears on the scene in the writings of Rabbi Yaakov Reinovitz, but I mean historically he was sent to England to start a Chovevei Tzion organization in England. And hadn't been one up to then. There were countless numbers of these little organizations in all the dorfs and all the villages and all the towns of Eastern Europe. And he was sent to London to try and start one. Obviously London's the place to go. Lots of money, isn't there? All these baronial gentlemen, they were pouring money towards Eretz Yisrael. There was a lot of promise. So he came with a letter from the Gedolim, and he approached Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, and he spent a day with him, and he was strongly encouraged by Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler. And he became very friendly with Dayan Reinovitz as well. And he started an organization which he called the Colonies, typical sort of name. Nowadays, colony, you don't want to talk about colonies anymore, you know, it's not a very weighty word. But the Colonies means settlements in Eretz Yisrael, financing them. He also became the superintendent of the Poor Jews Center, which looked after soup kitchens and others, particularly the immigrants who came into London. So he was an important character on the ground. Apart from his Zionist work, trying to raise money for Israel, he was also working with the poor of London, the immigrants who'd come from Eastern Europe. In 1889, he delivered a hesped on the death of Lawrence Oliphant. Now, you're talking about a Yiddish-speaking Jew who could hardly speak a word of English, and he's delivering Hesped on a landed gentry, Gentile of the Christian persuasion. How do I know that? Because I was doing some research. This is not in the collection, which is represented in the book. But in my research, I found that there was an archive in the National Library of Israel, a digital archive, of a Hesped which was delivered by this Rabbi Hirschowitz on the death of Lawrence Oliphant, and it was delivered to his society, the Society for the Colonization of Palestine. In other words, Hirschowitz Zion in England. He delivered it to those people at an event just like this, if you might. I don't know how many people were members of the organization, but he delivered it to them. And the Hesped is written in Yiddish, but there's a very brief English summary as well. Just before we go on to have a look at the Hesped and then move on to Lawrence Oliphant himself, Rabbi Hirschowitz later on went on to Australia, apparently on doctor's orders. He wasn't very healthy, and perhaps the Australian climate was healthier than the British climate. He established an important Orthodox chevra in Melbourne. He was instrumental in building all sorts of Orthodox institutions, mikvot and other things in Melbourne, a very important character, so important in fact that the late Rabbi Raymond Apple of blessed memory presented a paper on Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz to the Jewish Historical Society of Australia, our sister organization. And you can see this online. You can read all about the long history of Rabbi Hirschowitz. He went on to New York, and he subsequently came back to Eretz Yisrael, buried on Har HaZeitim. And we have some of his family over here. Stand up, Trevor Goldman. Trevor Goldman, what is he? Great-great-nephew, or great-great-great-nephew, or something of... very close relative of Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz.
Trevor?
I want to say a few things about Hirschowitz as a movement in Eastern Europe, of which this was just a little satellite community here in England, or here or there in England, that Rabbi Hirschowitz was trying to set up. What do we mean by Hirschowitz Zion? Chibat Zion is actually a correct name for the overall organization. The people who were members of Chibat Zion were the Hirschowitz Zion. They were the lovers of Zion. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Now this is my favorite photograph ever. There is no photograph in the world which is as extraordinary and as beautiful as this photograph, and nothing like this will ever be taken again in any generation subsequently, at least until the Mashiach comes. Why do I say this? This is a gathering of delegates from many different Hirschowitz Zion local organizations in Russia and Poland, came together in Katowice, in Poland, for a joint conference in 1884 to try and form an umbrella of all these little scattered little organizations. England didn't send a delegate. It was this very year that Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz tried to spread the wings of this organization into England. But in that year there was this conference. And why is it so remarkable? Because the organization Hirschowitz Zion at the time was a mixture of the frum and the highly secular. And they were all sitting shoulder to shoulder. Not only that, most of them had beards, so you really cannot tell one from the other. But I will try and show you some of these extraordinary characters in the front row. There really is. This is a gallery of the most important people in the secular world as well as the religious world, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Try that today. So, this sweet little man over here is Rav David Karolina, Rav David Friedman, a great gadol, wrote books on halacha. Next to him over here is the man who has a building nearby, Pinska, Leon Pinska, who is one of the figureheads of the secular Zionist movement, shoulder to shoulder. Over here we have the famous Rabbi Shmuel Moilever, the rabbi of Bialystok, and also the person who set up Maskeret Batya here and did an enormous amount of work, visited the world with Montefiore, with Rothschild to try and obtain better terms for the settlements in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Shmuel Moilever, co-leader of this movement, with Leon Pinska. secular, completely Haredi, you might say. And next to this completely Haredi, completely secular, this is Yehuda Leib Gordon, one of the greatest poets in the Zionist movement, as well, completely secular. Just as an additional bonus, this man sitting over here at the end is the man who made these tea bags. He's the original Mr. Visovsky. He's the baron of the tea world, one of the wealthiest people, built the biggest tea empire in the world. He was an absolutely devoted Zionist, so he's in this movement again as well. You won't see movements like this that come together in the same way, unfortunately. And guess what? This didn't last. How can you fuse together the really religious with the really secularists? They both had very different perspectives about what they were looking for in the state, the new state that they wanted to build with immigrants. They had very different views. One wants to build a westernized state with German as a language, possibly even, and the other wants a Haredi type state where people are keeping Torah and mitzvahs, with their tzitzis out, etc. Very different. So after a few years, this had to break up. Subsequently, before it broke up, we actually had a Netziv of Volozhin, who became one of the co-leaders of this organization, Hirschowitz of Chibat Zion. Also, even Rabbi Spector, who was the great rabbi in Chochmah, the leading Talmud Chacham in the world, considered to be at the time, he was also a member of this organization. But it was doomed to failure. And what subsequently happened was that the non-religious elements who couldn't remain in the organization anymore, 15 years later on, they took a ride, obviously, with Theodor Herzl when he started his secular movement, which was much more powerful, much more influential, much stronger, much wealthier. So they would jump ship to the secular movement. Ultimately, the more religious people, or some of them, moved off to a newly founded Mizrahi organization that was founded in 1902. But here we're still in 1884, when they hadn't really broken apart. So it's quite a remarkable situation over here. Really, I should say that all this Chibat Zion and Chovevei Zion, which are bring tears to our eyes, really, because we really feel strongly attached to these original pioneers. They didn't really have a long-lasting impact on the Zionist immigration into Eretz Yisrael. They were poor, they didn't have a lot of authority, they didn't have contacts with the elements of power in the great powers. So it turns out the Jewish Zionist movement over here, they helped the existing settlements, they brought a few score people over, they did try and they succeeded in convincing Rothschild to put his money in and to run an organization to support the immigrants into Israel. But it was small scale and small fry. So it's more of an emotional attachment and an awakening, really, of Jewry in Eastern Europe than it is a real achievement in physical terms on the ground in Eretz Yisrael. If you move on to the next slide, here, you don't have to read it all if you want to. I can linger if you want me to. This is a letter of introduction of Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz to Dayan Sussman Cohen. He was the son-in-law of Dayan Reinovitz, in which he explains why he's here, who is supporting him from Eastern Europe, and what he expects to achieve as a Chovevei Zion movement in England. So we can move straight away to the next slide. So over here, we actually have, from the collection, the rules of the colonies. In other words, the Chovevei Zion movement sent up had many rules. There were 29 rules. This is a very sophisticated organization. How many members it had? Did it have 29 members? I really don't know. I'm sure it wasn't as well off as this organization is, as we've seen. We've got plenty of reserves in this organization. But the point is that members, they would look for members in England, they would subscribe, they would all pay a regular amount, they would be encouraged to pay more, and they had a mission. The colonies shall be founded for improving really the moral and material position of our brethren, assisting them in immigrating and cultivating the land. Amongst the rules are, the members shall try their best to bring the colonies under protection of the English government. Yeah? They don't want to see the Ottoman Turks looking after these people because they were anti-Semitic, no organisation, they weren't going to achieve anything. So they wanted to try to create a state within a state, because Palestine, Israel at the time, was a Turkish protectorate, an Ottoman protectorate. So the first thing was to try to bring it under English control. We'll see later on that this is exactly what Lawrence Oliphant attempted to do, and ultimately I guess this succeeded, because after the Turks left the country, Britain came in, but it took a lot longer for anything really to crystallise in Israel. But that was the idea, try to bring it under English rule. Rule 4 is the most entertaining, and it says, none but peaceful and right-minded persons who conduct themselves respectably both towards their family and outsiders shall be admitted as members, whilst all mischief makers and quarrelsome persons of either sex are to be rejected, even though they may be willing to pay their shares in full. So if you're running an organisation and you've got difficult people, if you actually have rules like this in your constitution, you wouldn't be in the problem that you are now. Anyway, can we move on to the next slide?
Can you put the lights down a little bit, because then it's easy to read. Can you put the lights down?
Okay.
No,
that's all right.
The lights of the hall.
The lights in the hall, can we put them down?
Can you?
Yeah, the lights.
Oh, excellent. Okay, within the Hesped here of Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz for Lawrence Oliphant, that's the frontispiece page, if you like, from the digital record in the National Library of Israel. There's about 20 pages to this document. Just a little extract. This is what he wrote. It is no exaggeration to say that the 10 colonies now existing in Palestine are mainly alive through his exertions, Lawrence Oliphant's. Mr. Oliphant stands on a par with the greatest of our Jewish philanthropists. So this takes us in from, if you like, the Chobevei Tzion movement, the Jewish Chobevei Tzion movement, to the non-Jewish Chobevei Tzion movement. Of course, they wouldn't have that title of being Chobevei Tzion. They were individuals. So we move on to the next slide. And then we have Lawrence Oliphant, 1829 to 1888, this great hero who was so much applauded by Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz and by all others, as we will see as well. Incidentally, this picture on the left here, if you visit the Friends of Zion Museum, which is well worth visiting here in central Jerusalem, that is a very major part of their artwork, if you like. And the Oliphants are prominently featured there as being non-Jewish Friends of Zion. That's Lawrence, and that's Alice. His wife Alice was also very much involved. If you're looking to summarize him, given the sorts of characters he were, I've got some descriptions here. He was an evangelical Christian, he was a mystic, crazy mystic in many ways, but you have to be crazy to achieve what he actually achieved. He was a politician, a diplomat, an intelligence agent, a foreign correspondent, a writer, an adventurer, a rescue worker, and a Zionist. And that says a lot. So we move to the next slide. He was born actually in 1829 to Scottish aristocratic landowners, and therefore he was born with what they might say a silver spoon in his mouth. And his family were dedicated Christian evangelists, and so they believed strongly in returning the Jews to the Holy Land. Now, why should they want Jews to return to the Holy Land? Yes, they read the Christian Bible. Clearly, we know there was always this other motivation, that if they return the Jews to the Holy Land, then at some time they will accept Jesus, and then the second coming of the Messiah, whatever it is their particular messianic pretension. So there was that as well. Most Christian Zionists had that at the back of their minds. However, the fact is they were fervent Zionists, and they perhaps saw this as happening in 500 years' time. Meanwhile, you could take a ride with these Christian Zionists because they were authoritative, and they bore the power of the state behind them. So how does his career start? In 1856, he's 27 at the time, but he's well known because he's a campaigner for the Zionist cause. The Prime Minister, nonetheless, Lord Palmerston, invited him to meet with Moses Montefiore together with a Turkish Grand Vizier who runs Palestine, who was Ali Pasha, to look at a project in which would involve the construction of a rail line from Jaffa to Jerusalem. Well, we know there is, and there was, such a railway line, and they were negotiating to build one. The Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, wanted England to be much more involved in Palestine so that the other great powers would be pushed out of the way. There was a lot of competition. Palestine, Israel, even at the time, represented the Holy Land for so many religions. There was great power competition to try to show that people, each, whether it was France or Germany or England or you name it, would have, or Armenia or anybody else would have a strong foothold there. And they felt that if the British would be organising construction projects of a major nature, it would mean that Britain would have a much stronger role. This particular set of talks failed. Another set of talks a few years later succeeded. But he was already introduced to the people he needed to. Moses Montefiore he went on to have many meetings with, who admired Palmerston, who admired Oliphant greatly. 1863, something completely different happens. Because he's an adventurer and he's a brave man on the ground, he was sent, the government sends him as a war observer to Galicia. Completely different role. What's going on there? There is an uprising. The Polish and the Ukrainians rose against their Russian masters. This happened several times over several hundred years. We know that Russia has been going in and out and been deflected and come back in again several times. And the British were for the Polish-Ukrainian uprisers. They were for the rebels. Anything they could do to weaken a competitive great power is something they wanted to encourage. So they were looking to see how was this war going? How can we help these peasants in Poland and Ukraine move the Russians out of the way? And he was there for a while, and he even spent a week together with the rebels out in the field. So he was actually taking his life in his hands, and he was reporting back to Britain what he found to be the state of affairs. He became friendly with Adam Potocki, who was the leader of the rebels, a famous man if you were involved in Polish and Ukrainian history. So here we have his involvement in Eastern Europe. 2 years later, by the way, that uprising failed, so he goes home again, and he becomes a member of Parliament in 1865 for Stirling boroughs, whatever that means. He's an important character, aristocratic family, very easy to become elected as a member of Parliament. 3 years later, to everyone's astonishment, he caused outrage in Parliament because he resigned to join this cult, the Thomas Lake Harris community in New York. It was in Brockton, New York. These were very strange people indeed, believed in all sorts of second comings and third comings and whatever. And they started what they called a utopian community. They believed they were building a new world in isolation. It was a cult that had many hundreds of people in their grasp. And this Thomas Lake Harris was obviously a very hypnotic person and was able to get people, anyone interested in any form of mysticism. And both he and his wife, Alice, were very much mystics at heart, and he had them captured. In 1876, he leaves the sect. He's very, very disappointed. At this point, Thomas Lake Harris declares himself to be a reincarnation of Jesus. And he's had too much. He doesn't believe that he is a reincarnation. Now, his wife, Alice, remains behind for another few years. She remains besotted by Thomas Lake Harris, and eventually rejoins him later on to do a lot of wonderful work together with her husband. But he comes back himself to 1878, and then he throws himself into Zionism in a big way. And he devotes his full attention to it. If we move to the next slide, here we see Lawrence Oliphant. He presents what he calls Plan for Gilead, with the backing of Benjamin Disraeli, the then Prime Minister. The British are right behind him, the whole country's behind him. He has an extraordinary plan. And here you see, map of Israel, well, we all know, this is the east bank of the Jordan, here's the River Jordan. This is where B'nai Gad, B'nai Reuven, Chatzi, B'nai Manasseh decided to set up their camps. They didn't want to cross the Jordan with the rest. We know all the story from the Chumash. It's wonderful fertile land. And he has a vision, and this vision is that the Jews should have a section of this land of Israel, which is fertile, but has a relatively low population. He found that to be the case in Gilead. He was a very clever man, and all his plans were very, very well considered. He wasn't emotionally driven, he was actually very intellectually driven. And he would establish there, he hoped, a Jewish colony east of Israel there, under the protection of Great Britain. It would be under the protection of Great Britain. But how come? It belongs to Turkey. Isn't it Ottoman territory? So he would lease this land from the Ottoman Turks by paying considerable money. The Turks were a weakening empire by that time. Their empire, they had a huge empire, the Ottoman Turks at one time. It was crumbling, and anything they could do to earn income would be helpful, might help them sustain their empire. So in 1879, he arrived in Israel, in Palestine, and he toured the Gilead together with some of his colleagues to flesh out his plans. So he walked up and down the Gilead to see where things would be. Is this practical? When he was convinced that his plan would work, he did the obvious. He went north to Istanbul to meet the Sultan of Turkey and to propose this plan to the Sultan. And he was very confident in success. We move on to the next slide, please. And this is the plan for Gilead in Oliphant's own words. Just read it. He wants to obtain a concession from the Turkish government in the northern and more fertile half of Palestine, which the recent survey of the Palestine Exploration Fund proves to be capable of immense development. Any amount of money can be raised on it, owing to the belief which people have that they would be fulfilling prophecy and bringing on the end of the world. I don't know why they are so anxious for this latter event, he goes on to say, but it makes it a compelling commercial speculation, as it's a combination of financial and sentimental elements which will, I think, ensure success. And will be a good political move for the government, because the UK will then have a strong foothold in the land of Israel, which they didn't have at that time, but the superpowers are competing. So we move on to the next slide. Delightful slide, this is. The gentleman on the right who looks so happy, a person you can do business with, is Sultan Abdul Hamid. He's a formidably ugly character, apparently, even more ugly in his temperament than in the picture. They say this about this Sultan. Oliphant makes an appointment to see the Sultan. Oliphant is backed by the British government. He's a very, very important person by that time. But he's kept waiting for 11 months. Imagine how much patience you must have to say the Sultan can't see you now, the Sultan can't see you now, he's waiting for 11 months. During this period, he actually makes a visit to Romania, and he speaks to the jury in Romania and says, by the way, in a few years, a few months, I will have a colony for you in Palestine and in Gilead, and you'll all be able to leave this miserable country and travel. And although this doesn't have an impact straight away, it will bear fruit in future years, as we will see. He returns to Romania, and he finally has a meeting in April 1880 with the Sultan, which is a disaster after 11 months. The Sultan rejects the plan, and they have a heated argument, apparently, which you don't normally have with the Sultan of Turkey. But because he's so well protected, he has a British ambassador and colonial leaders behind him, he manages to escape the palace, and he returns to England. He is dejected, but he's certainly not finished. He's just lost the first round. He then completes a book which he calls The Land of Gilead, which is available to all interested purchasers. You can buy it in any good bookstore, I'm sure. And he completed this book in December 1880. And this book became quite widespread. It was read by all sorts of peoples with pretensions to helping to establish a state in Israel. Now, he actually dedicated this book to Princess Helena, the daughter of Queen Victoria. Apparently she was a strong supporter of the Zionist cause, and he says that he's dedicating the book to her. If we move on, May 1880, this is after he's been rejected, but you know it takes a while for the rejections to be realized, and so the Gazeta Lvovska, you can see this is from Lvov, still thinks he's in with a chance. And this is what they wrote. Palestine for the Jews. Imagine this is a really strong sentiment. This is the slogan now being repeated here and in London with increasing enthusiasm by both practicing Jews and a sizable number of Christian friends of the Jews. The Englishman Oliphant has presented the Sultan with the following plan. The lands of Gilead and Moab, once belonging to the Israelite tribes of Gad, Reuben and Manasseh, are to be turned into a Jewish colony. It is understood that the Sultan will be paid in jangling gold coins. This is what he writes. That's what they write. In this way, the Jews are to return to their own land. This will be the gathering point for the scattered people of Israel, and as should be anticipated for a restored Jewish state. You can feel the enthusiasm and the momentum building up behind Lawrence Oliphant and his plans. He was really a go-getter. However, everything is going to change in a very unexpected way. We move on to the next slide. We know that Oliphant has failed, but history takes its own course now. And in 1881, we have the terrible pogroms that break out in the Pale settlement in Poland and in Russia. This follows the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And as usual, the Jews are blamed. They had very, very little to do with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. But it's an opportunity for pogroms to be initiated by those who don't like the Jews. At that point in time, many more dozens of Hirschowitzian groups from across Russia and Poland are starting to work for the restoration of settlement in the Holy Land. When we looked at the Katowice conference, this was 3 years later. So we haven't done things quite in order because we've worked through first the general nature of the Hirschowitzian movement, and now we're looking at Oliphant's role in history. And at this point in time, this is when all this enthusiasm for Hirschowitzian groups breaks out. The Jews aren't going to be well accepted in Eastern Europe. They realize there's no solution. Even those Maskilim who felt there was a way of bringing together Russian culture with Jewish culture realized that this was a failure. And so there was additional momentum behind these groups. And again, as I said before, there were a mixture of religious and non-religious Jews coming together in their thousands. But at the same time, there is panic in Eastern Europe. Many thousands of Jews are fleeing eastward from Russia. They're moving towards Poland, if you like, the borders there, towards Galicia, and they crowd into Brody and Lvov in Galicia, near the eastern Polish border. What are they hoping to do? They're hoping to find a way to emigrate from Russia. Now, we know that the great emigration wave was a lot later, another 15, 20 years later, particularly to the United States. But the first wave, the smaller wave, started in 1881. And these are the Jews waiting to emigrate. So they flee eastward, and they crowd in 1882. There are many thousands of Jews there at the border, in very difficult conditions, in sanitary conditions, not enough food, not enough support from the world. And the British government actually plays a very positive role over here, and it raises funds to facilitate Jewish emigration to America. This is what they decided to do. Again, this is because they are Zionists, and they're people who realize, in Britain, much more so than the Britain you hear about later on in the 1940s, are really pro the Jews and moving them on, eventually to come to Palestine, but if not, at least to move them out of the Pale of Settlement, where they're suffering from the pogroms. And Lord Shaftesbury here plays a very important role to move the charitable funds forward. Now, Oliphant then argues, what are you doing trying to encourage Jews to emigrate to America? What about Palestine? Haven't you seen what I've been trying to do for the last few years? Let them go to Israel. This is their homeland, not America. And the British government are, to some extent, convinced that that should be tried at least. And they're persuaded, and he's drafted by the British government as a special commissioner to Galicia to organize emigration efforts. He's got to go there on the ground and get his hands dirty. Go there on the ground and get your hands dirty, they say to him, and he does. And he makes his way through from England, and in Vienna en route he meets all sorts of important people with whom he will establish relationships later on. He befriends other notable early Zionists, Peretz Smolenkin, who's a famous name, David Gordon, and they endorse his efforts. And they see him as potentially being the Messiah of the Jews in Eastern Europe. In fact, Smolenkin said about him, about Oliphant, if he is not a Messiah, then at least he is a Samson. Very interesting. In other words, he's a person of great power, and maybe he won't be working with God's imprimatur, but somehow his strength and his power and his momentum will push us over the line. Maybe we'll be able to leave Eastern Europe. If we move on to the next slide, Oliphant in Galicia, 1882. So the Oliphants, both of them, is now joined by his wife Alice. These are upper-class people brought up with a silver spoon. They're going to move into the mud and the snow and everything else of Galicia, a very poor area where there are going to be thousands of immigrants who want to be helped. So they reach Lvov on April the 12th, and immediately they begin their work with the gathered refugees. Oliphant was spoken of as a Cyrus, the Messiah for Israel. And in fact, it is said that in many homes in Eastern Europe, they had portraits up on the wall of Lawrence Oliphant next to other great characters. They saw him as potentially being their Messiah. He was then joined there by Samuel Montague and Dr. Asher. Asher, both important characters and working together with the chief rabbis' organizations in England. But Lawrence Montague is the boy among them, and he's the most powerful, obviously, by far. He attempted to divert as many as possible to emigrate to Israel. He says, what do you want to go to America for? It's terrible in America. Can you imagine how beautiful it is in Israel? You'll have Jaffa oranges. But of course, he's hampered. What's he going to do? How's he going to get them in? The Turks have refused large numbers of Jewish immigrants to enter. So he's terribly hampered because they can't get entry permits. And so in the end, as we know, the great majority left for America. But he was an enormous assistance to these people, as we'll see in a moment, who went to America as well. He tells the Jews who are thinking of going to Israel, wait a little while, stay where you are, don't take the next boat to America, because I'm going to find you a promised land. You're going to end up in Gilead, and it's beautiful there. The trees, the sunsets are beautiful, etc. Just have a little bit of patience. Some wait for him. The great majority don't have that patience. They just want to escape Eastern Europe. He becomes so important there, and so much a saviour figure, that a number of committees, many committees form in Eastern Europe, and they call themselves Oliphant committees. Can't get more personal than that. And they send delegates to meet him. And here he is met by Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever. He meets Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever, who we saw as a picture early on for the very first time. And Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever was deeply impressed by Oliphant's sincerity. And of course, Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever and Chovevei Tzion leader is meeting his counterpart, the Christian Zionist leader. If we move to the next slide. So here we see Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever, and that's his signature, with many letters from Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever in the Ranovitz collection. They're not related to this, but they're on halakhic matters. And this is what Rabbi Shmuel Mohilever had to say about Lawrence Oliphant after meeting him. He says, our brethren should not suspect that his intention is to strengthen the Christian religion and divert our people from their faith, which is what people would naturally suspect. He told me, in other words, Oliphant told Mohilever that he and his wife wish only for the fulfillment of the words of the prophets, that Israel will be restored to its land, and that they should do this in a way that enables Jews to keep every detail of the Jewish religion. So Rabbi Mohilever was very impressed by him. But of course, Rabbi Mohilever, as we said, the Chovevei Tzion Jewish movements were fairly powerless. Any person who could achieve anything was someone like Lawrence Oliphant. If we move to the next slide, again we see newspaper reports. These are translated. I didn't translate them myself. I found a source that translated these. Israelita. So here we are, 1882. The emigration efforts are being led primarily by Mr. Oliphant, the representative of the English committee. And here, this is the picture you see of the poor, desperate refugees who are trying to find a way out. The sullen figures pouring out of the rail carriages made an utmost sorrowful sight. They're coming out in Lvov and Brody in Galicia, trying to find a way out. The clothing the stricken people wore was no more than rags. One had to witness for oneself how the faces changed beyond recognition when, thanks to the generosity of the relief workers, Soon each person donned new clothing. Their gratitude was sincere and quite moving. Mr. Oliphant, in receiving each one of them, issued them registration cards, sharing with each a word or friendly smile. With incomparable cordiality, his spouse, Alice, embraced the poor children, accompanying their parents, and spoke with the ladies present. You see something here about Lawrence Oliphant. You have many of the Christian Zionists. They were romantics, they wrote books. Yes, they spoke about it at dinner parties. And here we have Lawrence Oliphant. He's not only a Zionist working in the Holy Land, he's a refugee worker. He's working with people on the ground. He's giving out registration cards. He's raising money for them. And his wife is actually embracing the little children that come out of carriages. This is altogether a different type of person. We move on to the next slide. The Krakow Reforma. The Russian Jews have no words to express their gratitude to Mr. Oliphant, who, as the second Moses, is leading them out of Muscovite captivity. Numerous Jewish families protecting themselves from persecution are now passing through Lvov and Warsaw on their way to America. He didn't want this, but this is where they were going. Mr. Oliphant negotiated such a significant reduction of the travel costs that the journey over land and sea to New York amounts to no more than 45 rubles per person. Well, anyway, El Al charges a lot more nowadays. But he was working to ease the transition of Jews wherever they wanted to go. Although his life's passion was to move them to Israel, he was prepared to finance and to help and to smooth their passage to America, as long as they could get out of the evils of Eastern Europe. We move on to the next slide. The final efforts, 1882. Well, by now, Oliphant's dreams of mass emigration to Israel were totally frustrated by the Turkish intransigence. The Turks weren't allowing them in. They were very, very stubborn. As well as the greater attraction of America to the fleeing refugees. This is obviously something that would have disappointed him greatly, but this was just the fact on the ground. So the Oliphants headed south from Galicia. Again, they're going to go to Istanbul, to Turkey. Going to wait again to see whether the Sultan will allow the country to be opened up to incoming immigrants. And it's a final effort to allow Jewish settlement in Israel. But en route, they have a long journey. We'll see a map in a moment. They're going to move south. They're going to go through Eastern Europe, south all the way to Istanbul by train. They're going to get up in various places. They headed south from Galicia to Istanbul, but en route they went through Moldavia and Romania, and they disembarked at Sadigura. Sadigura, who knows Sadigura? Hasidic place. To meet with Rabbi Avraham Yaakov Friedman, the Rabbi, the Sadigura Rebbe at that time. He was urged by Oliphant to establish a Jewish national fund to purchase Israel from Turkey. What is interesting is that Oliphant had been told that the most influential, the greatest, most saintly Jewish rabbi in the whole of Eastern Europe is the Rebbe of Sadigura. If anyone can do anything to persuade the population to move to the Holy Land, it is the Sadigura Rebbe. Sadigura, we'll see, had a dynasty of its own. I wouldn't say he was the most influential, but certainly that's what was told to Lawrence Oliphant. And unfortunately, the Rebbe turned down his proposal very, very politely, but he wasn't going to have any of it. Let's see why. But first of all, let's move to the next slide. There's a map. He's near Lviv, it says over there, where within the red area, that's sort of Galicia. It's a sort of a region which straddles now Poland and the Ukraine. And so he makes his way down through Romania, through Moldova. He goes through Romania, meets the Sadigura Rebbe, then he's going to have to go through Bulgaria, and go south, and eventually get to Turkey. That's the travel plans, if you like, of the of the family Oliphant. We move to the next slide.
Where is Sadigura?
I'm not sure. It's somewhere in Romania, but I couldn't find a map. Actually, it's called Sajora or something now. I mean, we have some Hungarians over here probably be able to translate Sadigura to the Romanian equivalent. Romania. My brother was a Romanian. Google. I should look up Google. Okay. Back in Google. So, what do you see over here? This palatial home. Would you like to have a home like that in Rabbi or wherever you want to be, in Talbir or wherever? This is the home of the Rebbe of Sadi Gura. Now, Sadi Gura comes from the Rizhin dynasty. They had a unique approach that the Rebbes would show themselves as wealthy as possible in order that people would look up to the Rebbe and see this is, if you like, a reincarnation of David HaMelech. This is actually brilliant psychological ruse to make the Hasidim feel that they belong to a very important and very aristocratic dynasty. You know, in other Hasidic dynasties, the Rebbe was poor, and he looked poor, and he looked for Brochen, and the people saw him felt even more for Brochen than they felt before they saw him. Here, when they saw, this is where the Sadi Gura Rebbe lives, etc., it really lifted them. Anyway, so this is the report of Lawrence Oliphant at the bottom of this picture. The whole Jewish community of Sadiga awaited our arrival. This is his eyewitness report of his meeting, lining both sides of the street to see the Gentile coming to the Rebbe. I was led into a room, much like a princely court, furnished with precious gold and silver antiques. There I met the Rabbi, accompanied by 2 servants. Regal authority was in his face. I was convinced that he could lead and command his people with just the barest gesture. So if we move to the next slide, this is what the Rebbe of Sadi Gura, but let's just look at this over the moment. Well, maybe first of all, this is the Rebbe of Sadi Gura. This is an artist's picture of him. I couldn't find any good photographs, I looked everywhere. Anyway, this is what the Sadi Gura Rebbe said, and it's something you could predict. Jews must await redemption by a miracle and not by purchasing land. He very politely told Oliphant that he was at Tzadik Umas Ha'olam, but this is not the formula that was required right now. The Jews have to wait for the redemption, and they mustn't push the redemption. This has been a philosophy, later on, of Satmar for a very long time. Anyway, this is interesting because this is a comment of Oliphant after meeting and being disappointed. So he writes, as the rabbi is by no means the only individual I have come across in the course of my life claiming to have higher gifts than those of ordinary mortals, and as I am convinced in some instances that these persons were sincere, and it would be rash therefore to assume that such specially endowed persons were all impostors, I am by no means prepared to pass any opinion upon the claims of the rabbi. Very, very modest statement. He's actually saying, Oliphant is saying, I find this to be a very impressive character indeed. Maybe he's superhuman, maybe he's supernatural, I can't pass comment on him. Unfortunately, my mission has failed with the Sadi Gura Rebbe. If we move to the next slide, he's making his way still southwards to Istanbul. They stopped in Romania, as we saw in Sadi Gura, but there they also attended a number of local Chovevei Tzion sessions, just the sessions where they stopped on the road, and where there was a Chovevei Tzion group, they joined in, they were invited in, and he would address them. How would he address them? In the Queen's English? How would these Romanians or Moldovians know what he'd say? We'll see why I know it. We'll see how he had an extraordinary interpreter, one of the most famous people. Anyway, he told a conference in Jassy, which is somewhere in Romania, that he supported with his whole heart the attendees' efforts to organize the settlement of their ancient homeland. Moreover, he explained, no doubt feeling his views had been reconfirmed by Rabbi Friedman, that is the Sadi Gura Rebbe, that they could count on enormous sums of money, but not from Jewish benefactors, but from British Protestants. As you'll see later on. He's given up with the notion that the Jews of Eastern Europe are going to finance anything big in Palestine. Either they don't have the money, or they don't have the commitment in one way or another, or they believe they have to wait for Mashiach, whatever it is. However, British Protestants, in other words, Christian Zionists, were very wealthy, and they would throw money in. We see the equivalent now in America, do we not, of the Baptists who are paying large amounts of money to help fund various organizations in Israel, and actually very, very valuable support, lots of charities that otherwise would be fairly destitute. Their money comes in. Sometimes the organizations here don't want to admit that it's coming from Christian money in mid-America, but it is. So the Christian Zionists said, okay, if the Jews aren't going to finance this, says Oliphant, Christian Zionists will. The British press presented Oliphant's journey to Istanbul as a triumphal march through Eastern Europe. He was really a hero of the time, not just by the Jews, but actually across many of the aristocrats in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Towards Istanbul, 1882. So he recollects of his trip coming down from Brody right down to Istanbul. He said, I had occasion to visit Brody. He's talking about the first work he did up there with the refugees. This time as the emissary of the Mansion House Committee, which is what was called the charitable committee for the distressed Jews in Eastern Europe, for the purpose of distributing relief to some 15,000 distressed Russian refugee Jews who had taken refuge there in a starving condition. I then made the journey from Brody to Yassi by rail, and so intensely wrought up were the expectations of the much suffering race, the Jews, who form the largest proportion of the population of this part of Europe, that at every station they were assembled in crowds with petitions to be transported to Palestine, the conviction apparently having taken possession of their minds that the time appointed for their return to the land of their ancestors had arrived, and that I was to be their Moses on the occasion. He's beginning to feel uncomfortable himself because he's not able to achieve what he wants to achieve, but the expectations of these people in Eastern Europe are still with him, that he is going to be their Messiah. He's going to disappoint them, unfortunately, but he is to be the Messiah. We move to the next slide. Oliphant's last efforts in Istanbul. He's reached Istanbul at last. Well, he refused to give up on achieving Turkey's approval to allow the settlement of Jewish immigrants. He's going to try once more. He tries once more, but he's rejected again. But he has a brilliant loophole which he's discovered. And this loophole is based upon the knowledge of the Treaty of Berlin. In the Treaty of Berlin, in wherever that was, 1882 or whatever, some of Europe was redivided. The Turks were losing their empire, the Ottoman Empire, and they controlled Romania at the time. That was part of the Romanian Empire. That became independent as a result of the Treaty of Berlin, and Romania was given its own government and its own independence. Now, Romania had a big Jewish community. As luck would have it, the Romanians, for their own probably anti-Semitic reasons, refused to give Romanian nationality to their Jews. Well, that was brilliant, because that means they retained their Turkish nationality. So he said, I've got Jews here in Romania who are actually Turkish citizens. They have the right to enter Palestine. And he brought them in. He brought them in through this loophole. And these initial immigrants were the first that settled Rosh Pinah and Zichron Yaakov. So he essentially founded Zichron Yaakov and Rosh Pinah through these settlers who were Romanians he'd managed to bring across. He still urged patience for Russian Jews hoping to emigrate. And he wrote actually in one of his memoirs that he believes that there is what he called a great agitation gaining momentum in both England and America. And the Turks can't put off a favourable solution much longer. In other words, there's so much pressure on the Turks. Their empire is crumbling around them. The other empires are growing in strength. There will come a time at which they will surely acquiesce to allow the Jews in. Have patience. However, Oliphant himself began to lose patience. He realized he couldn't wait forever. And by October 1882, the Oliphants had lost all hope of changing the Sultan's mind. What's left for them? They failed to move large numbers of Eastern European Jews into the Holy Land. So what they decided they had to do, well, they had to move to the Holy Land themselves. Let us make Aliyah, and let us leave our lives in Eretz Yisrael. They failed with their main agenda, but let them come into Israel, where again they were going to be quite instrumental and very helpful to the fledgling Moshavim in Eretz Yisrael. So we move, and you've done it already, reading my mind.
When was the Skelet budget founded?
Around 1882 or something like that. So together with, that was Maskeret Bacha, yes. And that was very much Rabbi Shmuel Moenever. He was disinterred from his graves in Eastern Europe, and he was moved. His grave is now in, well, the only one, you could say, of a Gadol, who was moved, and he's interred now just outside the town. You can visit his grave, Rabbi Shmuel Moenever. Anyway, the Oliphants are now in Israel, and they're going to be there between 1883 to 1885. And he goes together with his private secretary, who you know who he is, Naftali Inbar, famous name, who wrote, authored Hatikva. Hatikva is Naftali Inbar. Inbar was a poet. Apparently, he was also a genius in languages. He's supposed to have been fluent in up to 12 languages, including all the Eastern European versions. This is how Oliphant was able to get around and communicate with all these different bodies that he needed to communicate with in Eastern Europe and address conferences and stuff like that. And Inbar dedicated the first book of poems, which concluded Hatikva, to Lawrence and Alice Oliphant. It was because Inbar considered them to be really two very, very great individuals. Anyway, Lawrence traveled the Galilee together with his wife, helping and advising the Chalutzim there. Because he was such a wise man, he was able to obtain funds as well. He also donated 1,000 rubles to the founding settlers of Yesod HaMa'aleh up there in the Galil, another, well, quite an important foundational colony in Israel. And he gave advice to others. He was able to channel Protestant funds from England into Israel. So some of the money coming in to support these communities, again, was funneled through Lawrence Oliphant while he was in Israel. They both became sick in Israel. By the way, that picture is Oliphant House. This is not in your local Oliphant or whatever. It's near Haifa somewhere. That building now is a commemorative museum for fallen Druze soldiers. So you can visit it. I'm not sure there's anything Oliphantish left in the house, but that is where they made their home when they were here. But he travelled around the country. And they both became sick in December 1885. Alice died in January 1886. Lawrence came back to visit London, only for a visit in 1888, but he died there, and he's buried in England, unfortunately. It's a shame they didn't move his grave somewhere to Eretz Yisrael, given he devoted his life to it. The final slide that I have over here. What is his legacy? I mean, what did he achieve? He failed to achieve a lot of what he wanted to achieve, but he achieved a great deal. He actively worked for the benefit of Eastern European Jews, and he gave them both financial support and hope for a better future. And as I say, he was a rescue worker. He was actually there on the ground. You think of the Raoul Wallenbergs, you think of the other sort of rescue workers who were on the ground in very difficult conditions, helping refugees coming off the train lines. And that's what he was, together with his wife. And he had no necessarily great hopes of moving great numbers of them to Israel. He hoped so, but they needed help, and he gave them that help. He was central to the establishment of Rosh Pinah and Zichron Yaakov by achieving the immigration of the first set of Romanian Jews. He passed monies collected from Christian evangelists to the settlers of both of these places and allowed the struggling enterprises to survive. He's written up in many places as being the bridge for the survival of all the settlements, as Rabbi Elber Hirschowitz said earlier on, all the 10 colonies, until Baron Rothschild came on the scene. We all think about Rothschild, and he paid, but these were struggling places that would have closed without the first work that was done by Lawrence Oliphant. And his plans for settling Israel were organized, they were detailed, they were strategic, they were structured. They had the support of international statesmen and governments. Maybe not that of the Turks, but all the other of the great Western powers. And this set the stage for Herzl 15, 20 years later to achieve much greater momentum had it not been for Oliphant. I mean, he praises Oliphant in some of his writings. Some of the foundational work, if you like, exploratory work, had been done by Lawrence Oliphant. He talked to a lot of those people, he'd seen what was there on the ground, what was needed, And he was an important figure in England at the time, which was the main country that might have succeeded in bringing large numbers of Jews through from Eastern Europe. On a religious basis, I mean, when we look at it, there's a statement in Mishlei, Lev Malachim B'Yad Hashem, which is taken to understand that not just the Jewish people, but the leaders of foreign powers, of non-Jewish countries, are also in the hands of Hashem. In other words, Hashem selects key individuals of different nations at different times to perform great goodness, if you like, to the Jewish people. We don't know why particular individuals are chosen, but they work extremely hard. We see that Cyrus brings the Jews back from Persia to begin the Second Commonwealth, and the beginning of a new Beis Hamikdash. Oliphant was almost on the cusp of being someone similar. Of course, it didn't happen, but he's B'Yad Hashem. And these are selected individuals. These are individuals with power and with influence. You know, the ordinary little Jew in Eastern Europe was powerless, had no influence. But these are people with power and influence. And they were extremely important in leading the country in its earlier stages, creating that level of momentum which later led to Herzl and the later Zionist movements, which leave us where we are today. So that's my presentation. Just over an hour long. I hope that people have remained with me for an hour. Thank you very much for your...
Thank you very much. I wonder if there are any questions people would like to ask us. Hand up at the back already.
Oh no.
Going back to your favourite photograph
Yes.
of all times, how did you identify those gentlemen in it?
I didn't identify. I mean, Rabbi Shmuel I knew very well that picture because we have, the book deals with him. But there is a version of that photograph which gladly contains the names of these characters underneath. It wasn't in the version I showed you because I wanted you to think that I was clever.
I know you are!
This is in another form.
I was really quite interested to hear about the length of the Hesped for Lawrence Oliphant, because I knew that when they started the first Chobabit Sion group in Glasgow, the Yiddish presentation about Chobabit Sion was a 4-hour shiur, 4-hour lesson. So people in those days really had powers to concentrate. They really weren't people who just had to have a sentence or two. But there's somebody else at the back.
The grave of Oliphant in Twickenham Cemetery is the most distinguished grave in the entire cemetery.
Really?
It's right next to the Strawberry Hill House, and it is 400 meters away. And in fact, today I spoke to the director, and she said she's going to walk past, as she knows you're speaking tonight. It is. I've seen the. I've seen it. It's really beautiful. So somebody actually wanted to invest in giving him a good send-off. I don't know who, and I don't know, but it's a beautiful tombstone.
Martin has a lot of knowledge on this and a lot of dealings with some of the same characters historically, some of the organisations that he's been involved with, and so it's interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yes.
Offspring.
Sorry?
Any Oliphant offspring carried on the parents' good work?
I don't know. I imagine it was a no question.
Any children to the Oliphant couple?
No, I don't
But he had a second wife, he married again. After his first wife died, he married again.
I didn't see anything about their children, whether they had children or not. Maybe they had no children.
I don't know, he did marry.
Not really a question, but more observation. Talking about that photo where you have all the people sitting shoulder to shoulder, probably the modern day equivalent would be the Knesset.
Quite possibly.
Where you get the full arrange, you get the Arabs.
Yes.
Can you repeat the remarks, please?
He said Dali has said that that photograph's really not so unique because we do have some photographs of members of the Knesset where it does seem as though some religious people are sitting side by side with some irreligious people. They may not be Gedolei Hador for some religious people, but yes, it's not entirely unique.
Oliphant in the room.
Need to speak louder.
What's that connection? I said at one point in his life, my brother was at Oliphant Yeshiva. What's that connection?
The Rabbi Oliphant,
Well, it is right. There's a Rabbi Oliphant who was it one of the yeshivas in Yerushalayim? He was a Rosh Yeshiva.
Rabbi Elephant.
Elephant.
I'm not sure if he's elephant or really Oliphant.
No, it's elephant.
It's not the
Elephant.
same. As far as I know, there's no relationship. Martin will tell you there's a relationship. Or maybe Rabbi Zalewski.
I'm not aware that any elephants are related to Oliphant.
Yes, I thought it was very unlikely. Anybody else want to take any comment? Yes, go on, Bessie.
I'd also like to make a comment. First of all, I'd like to say it was just fascinating for somebody who's not all that interested in history normally. I'm afraid that, but really, it sort of like gives a ray of light into what's happening today. Some of our best friends who are suspect are supporters of Israel, supporters of, and I've actually been involved recently with a group in Germany of non-Jewish Christians for Israel and for Holocaust survivors. And, you know, and they are so sincere, and they want to learn, and they want to support, and they want to be our ambassadors against anti-Semitism. And it sort of rang bells with, you know, and
there are Dutch Protestants as well, who are very much into this as well. Countries where there is a lot of anti-Semitism also have some very strong pro-Jewish Christians as well, who are a bit of an endangered species, but nevertheless they're very good friends of Israel.
Oliphant was very, very upset by Shapiro. Shapiro was the one who discovered the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, which were thought not to be real. And Oliphant knew him, and he was one of the first people who came along and said, sorry, there's something wrong in this whole story. So these were Jews who became Christians, and he was a Christian who loved Jews. There was both going on at the same time.
Right, if there are no more questions, it really just left me just to thank on everybody's behalf Ellie for a really spellbinding talk. It really had 100% concentration from everybody. It was very, very much enjoyed. And if you have a third topic, we will be interested to hear from you in due course. Thank you very much. So there's still some tea, coffee available if you want to stay on for 2 minutes.